The gentleman from Cal recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, just a block away from this building, the Capitol, stands the Supreme Court. Like many other courthouses across this country, it bears the image of the goddess of justice. Many of you know the statue. She holds a set of scales symbolizing the fairness and equality of law. She wears a blindfold symbolizing impartiality. Unfortunately, this bill does not represent either of those issues. Like so many other bills this House Democratic leadership has forced onto the floor, this bill suffers from the same taint. The provisions in this bill are the result of backroom negotiations and special deals to exempt some powerful interest groups at the expense of smaller ones. But the unfortunate thing about this bill today is that rather than respecting the First Amendment promise to protect the speech of all Americans, it attempts to use the First Amendment as a partisan sledgehammer to silence certain speakers in favor of others, especially unions. Mr. Chairman, this bill bans corporations with government contracts over $10 million from political speech. The sponsor says that's because those contractors might try to influence decisions by government officials. But this bill does nothing for the labor unions who are parties to collective bargaining agreements with the government. Even though unions have huge amounts of money at stake and every incentive to influence decisions about the contracts by government officials, it does nothing. We offered an amendment to uphold the fairness and equality, but that was rejected in the committee. A second example, Mr. Chairman, is we all agree that foreign citizens shouldn't influence our elections, whether they are foreign citizens that are part of the foreign corporation or foreign citizens that are part of a union with interest in the United States. This bill requires CEOs to certify under penalty of perjury that their companies are not foreign nationals, under the newly expanded standard of the bill. But the bill does nothing to ensure that when labor unions are spending money on elections, that money did not come from people who are themselves prohibited from spending money to influence American elections. Again, we offered an amendment to treat corporations and unions equally under the bill by requiring the same certification of labor union chiefs, but again, it was rejected. Mr. Chairman, a third example. I point to the centerpiece provision of this bill, the so-called disclosure requirement. The bill requires organizations to disclose information about the individuals who gave more than $600. But the Federal Election Committee asked everybody else to do it at $200. As one of the majority members of our committee asked,
Time expired.
I require more time.
Yield the gentleman an additional minute.
The gentleman is recognized for one more minute.
As one of the majority members of our committee asked, where did that number come from? Well, it's just high enough to make sure unions will not have to report any of their dues. Because as you see, the average for a union is $377 in 2004. So it treats them different than we treat every other American in every other campaign. So while candidates and political parties have to itemize contributions from donors above $200, we have a different rule in this bill, a rule that apparently designed for the convenience of unions. Again, we offered an amendment to make this disclosure requirement the same as how all federal laws have long required disclosure of donors to candidates and political parties, but again, it was rejected. Rather than spending time today listening to Americans and addressing the number one priority in this country, helping to create jobs and grow our economy, again and again I watched this Congress mirrored in its own partisan priorities. I listened to the gentleman from Maryland. He happens to also be the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Committee. 30 seconds.
Yield the gentleman 30 additional seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
As I listened, I remembered last week as we sat on this floor thinking this bill would come together, but the backroom deal was not done. As I started this speech thinking of the goddess of justice, and I go through this bill, the blindfold is taken off and the thumb is put on the scale to weigh to one side. This does not honor the First Amendment. This does not honor the fairness of what this building represents. I ask for a no vote and yield back the balance of my time.
The